I keep replaying the moment she said it, not because it surprised me but because of how exactly she chose those words. "You're suffocating me, I need to live on my own." She didn't raise her voice, didn't pull away dramatically, didn't slam a door. She just said it like she was reading a bulletin off a wall she'd already decided to ignore afterward. I remember nodding like I understood, like any normal person would just go home and sleep on it. And I did go home, technically, but sleep didn't come. And I kept sitting in the dark thinking about the expression on her face. The little twitch at the corner of her mouth that she probably thought went unnoticed. I don't think she meant to hurt me, but she wanted distance. She said it like distance was a kind of oxygen she'd been deprived of. Each night after that conversation, I went to see her anyway. I never pushed inside her apartment. I never crossed the threshold without her permission. I just showed up when she said she was free, or when she didn't say anything at all but didn't explicitly tell me not to. It wasn't even hope that drove me, it was something thinner, quieter, like following a fading smell down a hallway. I'd ask her out, sometimes casually, sometimes with that careful joking tone that made it feel unserious enough to ignore. She'd just shake her head, slow and tired, and say not tonight, or maybe later, or that she wasn't feeling up to anything. I'd shrug, pretend it didn't matter, and walk out into the corridor with that same hollow knot forming under my ribs. But every time I left, I found myself thinking about how she leaned against the doorframe when she spoke, one shoulder slightly higher than the other. The way she held her hair back with the same two fingers each time she was trying to soften a refusal. I started noticing more than I should have, small things, details that accumulated like dust on a mirror. For example, when I asked if she wanted to get dinner, she'd avoid my eyes only in the last second of saying no, as if she didn't mind rejecting the idea but didn't want to see the effect of rejecting me. Or how she'd keep her voice low, level, as if speaking louder would somehow make things final. I don't think she meant to be cruel, but something in her politeness cut deeper than anger would have. It made it feel like she wasn't pushing me away because I'd done something wrong, but because she had already accepted that I was expendable. She'd let me into her living room sometimes when she wasn't busy, though it never lasted long. I'd sit on her couch and make some small comment about her plants or her books, and she'd smile in that tight, brief way that made me think she was trying to act like things were normal. But she always kept a kind of emotional distance, a chill in the room that wasn't from the air conditioning. She'd pull her knees up to her chest when she sat on the opposite chair, as though making herself smaller, compact, untouchable. I'd watch her hands. She had these precise gestures when she talked, fingers tapping lightly against her leg, then stopping, then starting again when she was trying to redirect the conversation. I liked that about her, that she had these subtle rhythms in her behavior that she assumed nobody paid attention to. But I did. I paid attention to everything. The strangest part is that I wasn't angry, not really. There was frustration, yes, but it wasn't the kind that explodes. It was the kind that settles, like sediment in water. I felt fascination more than anything, like I was studying the slow, methodical way someone pulls back from someone else. She didn't realize how obvious it was, maybe because she didn't expect me to be watching for it. Each night I left her place, the hallway felt colder than it should have, and I'd walk the same path to the stairs without thinking. I'd go down one floor, then pause, then keep going. I don't know why I started doing that, pausing at the first landing, looking back up at her door, imagining her going back to whatever she did after closing it behind me. Maybe washing a dish, maybe scrolling through her phone, maybe complaining to someone about how persistent I was. It didn't really matter. What mattered was the quiet gap in my chest, the unanswered question I kept circling around. If I was suffocating her, why did she still let me come by at all? Why didn't she just cut me off completely? I asked her that once, gently. She said something about not wanting to be harsh, about needing time to think, about appreciating me but not knowing what she wanted. Her voice had that tired softness that people use when they're trying not to provoke someone. It didn't provoke me. It just made me feel like I was being managed, handled in the safest way possible. She didn't owe me anything, I know that, but the ambiguity lingered in a way that felt intentional. Even if it wasn't, the more she turned me down, the more the refusals began to feel like part of a pattern. Something predictable and almost comforting in its inevitability. I knew she'd say no, but I kept asking anyway. It wasn't about getting a yes. It was about watching how she said no. About seeing the slight tremor in her breath, the way her hand drifted to her necklace when she was anxious, the way her foot tapped once, quickly, before she caught herself. Little tells. I started memorizing them because they felt like the only honest pieces she let slip. And every time I left quietly, she seemed relieved, though she tried not to show it. That relief did something to me, not anger, not bitterness, but a kind of curiosity about how far that relief stretched. Whether it would grow or fade or turn into something else if I kept showing up and then walking away before she had to ask me to. I didn't accuse her of anything. I didn't demand clarity or try to corner her into some emotional confession. I just existed in the blurry space she left me in. But that space started feeling less like a place she put me in, more like a place I could move around in, examine from different angles. Sometimes when she rejected me, she would follow it with a soft apology. She always said it quietly, almost under her breath, like she was afraid of acknowledging that she might be hurting me. I never told her whether she was or wasn't. I think not telling her gave me more control over the situation than saying anything would have. She closed the door slowly, and I'd hear the faint click of the lock sliding into place even though she'd probably tried to do it discreetly. I wouldn't linger outside her door. I didn't want her thinking I was some kind of threat. I just wanted her to know I was still there in her life, still orbiting the edges. The distance she asked for became a kind of ritual, me approaching, her pulling back, me accepting it silently. But beneath that silence, resentment began pooling in thin layers. Not enough to spill over, not enough for her to notice, but enough that I could feel the weight of it settling on the inside of my ribcage. The resentment wasn't about her saying no. It was about how she said it without thinking about the impression it left on me. How she didn't seem to consider that every refusal carved out a small hollow space that I had to fill with something else: observation, analysis, patience. I don't think she ever realized how closely I paid attention to her. She probably thought I just shrugged things off and went home to live my separate life. But I didn't shrug anything off. I stored everything quietly, like collecting samples of a rare insect. Nothing dramatic, nothing aggressive, just careful, calm attention. The more she withdrew, the more clearly I saw the shape of the boundary she thought would keep things contained. It wasn't a strong boundary. It was soft, flimsy, made of her discomfort and guilt, and I stayed on the safe side of it, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her uncertainty. Sometimes when she refused me, she'd tilt her head slightly to the right, as if she was trying to soften the blow. That little tilt stuck with me for days. I'd picture it while lying in bed, the way her hair fell over one eye, the way she blinked slower when she wanted the moment to pass. I started to understand that my fascination wasn't about her saying yes, it was about watching her navigate the discomfort of saying no. There was something revealing in it, something honest in a way her smiles weren't. And even though I left every night without protest, there was a growing sense inside me that she had no idea what I was actually carrying out the door with me. Small pieces of her gestures, her tone, her refusals, all arranged neatly in my mind like files in a cabinet. When she said, "You're suffocating me," I don't think she meant it literally. I think she meant she could feel the weight of my presence even when I wasn't doing anything. And maybe she was right, but suffocation requires force, and I never used any. I simply stayed close, asked gently, listened carefully, and walked away when told to. If that was suffocation, then it was the quietest kind imaginable, the kind you don't notice until you're already breathing differently. She said she needed to live on her own, and I let her, at least, on the surface. Underneath, something else was beginning to take shape, something patient, measured, and quietly certain. I didn't know then where it would lead. I only know I wasn't done watching the way she pulled away from me. I started noticing patterns without meaning to, or at least that's what I told myself when the routines began forming in my mind like constellations I hadn't known I'd been memorizing. It wasn't deliberate in the beginning. It was something softer, quieter, like the way you become aware of the sound of a clock only after the room goes still. I'd visit her less often, partly because she asked for space and partly because I wanted to see what she did when she thought I wasn't around. There was nothing aggressive about it. I kept my distance. I respected the invisible boundary she believed she'd built, but I watched all the same, the way anyone might watch an animal in the woods without stepping into its path. She left her curtains half open most days. Not fully, not enough to expose herself, just enough that a sliver of her living room became visible from the street. I noticed she always opened them at the same angle, as though pulling them further would feel too vulnerable. I'd pass by on my way home sometimes, or on my way nowhere in particular, just drifting through the evening because it felt wrong to go straight back to my apartment and sit in the stillness. I'd see her silhouette moving inside, small motions, nothing dramatic. She'd carry a mug, sit on the floor instead of the couch, tuck her feet under her like she was conserving heat she couldn't find in another person. I never approached the window. I never tapped, never lingered long enough to be obvious. But I watched in the way one watches a familiar streetlight flicker, understanding its rhythm long before it realizes it has an audience. At first I thought paying attention to her routines would make me feel closer to her, but instead it created a different feeling entirely, something like studying the internal mechanics of a clock. You don't feel affection for a clock. You feel precision, predictability, reassurance. And she was becoming predictable in ways I don't think she intended. She woke up earlier after I stopped visiting. I could tell by the timing of the lights through the blinds. Before, when we still had some kind of closeness, her lights didn't come on until 8 or so. After she told me I was suffocating her, morning arrived at 7:30 sharp. I don't know if she was sleeping better without me, or worse, or simply differently, but the change was consistent enough that it became another data point in the growing pattern. She always made coffee into motions, grinder, then kettle. I could hear it faintly when I passed the building early enough, that soft mechanical rhythm blending with the morning traffic. She never opened her windows fully in the mornings, only in the late afternoons when the sun hit the opposite side of the building and she wouldn't be silhouetted. She took short walks around the block 3 times a week, usually after 5, clutching her phone but barely looking at it, as though she wanted to appear occupied without actually engaging with anything. I followed once, not close, not in a way she'd ever notice. I just happened to walk behind her at a distance, matching her pace without letting myself drift too near. It wasn't about pursuit. It was about observing the way she moved when she wasn't performing politeness for me. Her shoulders relaxed when she was alone. She walked slower, almost aimlessly, her attention caught by the small things she ignored when speaking to another person: puddles, cracks in the sidewalk, a stray cat that paced toward her before darting away. Watching her alone was different from watching her with me. With me, there had always been a kind of tension, subtle but present, like she was bracing for something I wasn't going to do. Alone, she seemed softer, but also lonelier, as if solitude didn't comfort her as much as she told herself it did. I'm not saying that in a romantic way. I don't think it was romantic at that point. It felt more like studying the internal contradictions of a person who didn't fully understand herself. But the more I noticed, the more the quiet fixation settled into my bones. Not desire, not longing, something flatter, like a low hum under the floorboards. I started recording the patterns, not in writing but in memory. I could predict her lights, her movements, her habits, and each new piece of information slid into place with the same soft click as a puzzle piece. It wasn't about controlling her or influencing anything she did. It was about understanding how she existed when she wasn't actively rejecting me. There was something intimate in that, though not in any way she would have recognized. She began avoiding certain things after a while, checking her peephole before opening her door, double locking it even when she knew I wasn't coming by. The double click of the lock was sharp, practiced, almost ritualistic. She didn't know I'd picked up on that. She didn't know how sound carried through the hallway at night when everything else was quiet. I never stood outside her door, never lingered long enough to make her feel unsafe. But I passed by sometimes, going nowhere in particular, and I heard it. The extra layer of security meant to keep the world out. It was interesting how much that detail soothed me, rather than stung. It meant she expected things from the world, not from me. Her fear wasn't personal. It was habitual. She was someone who reacted to small anxieties before they fully formed, and that made her easier to read, easier to anticipate. I don't know when I started watching her from farther away across the street, from the bus stop, from the corner of the intersection where she couldn't possibly recognize me. It felt less intrusive at a distance, like checking the weather through a window. I didn't take photos or notes. I didn't need to. Everything she did lodged itself naturally in my mind. She had a habit of talking to herself when she thought no one could hear. Not full sentences, just half-whispered reminders or small exhalations that carried a syllable at the end. I heard them once through her open window when I passed by. She wasn't saying anything meaningful, just muttering under her breath about misplacing her keys. But the way she said it, the gentle frustration, the resigned sigh, told me more about her emotional landscape than any conversation we'd had. I started recognizing her moods before she did. When she was anxious, she walked faster and held her breath for 1 or 2 seconds at a time. When she was tired, she dragged her left foot slightly. When she was lonely, she lingered by her window instead of closing the curtains. These were small things, so small that anyone else would have missed them. But I didn't miss anything. She had no idea how visible she was to someone who knew how to look without expecting anything in return. I didn't reach out to her during this period. I let her have the space she claimed she needed. I didn't want to push her, didn't want her to think I was waiting for an invitation back into her life. The distance was part of the observation. The distance made everything sharper. I didn't feel resentment anymore. The frustration from part one had settled into something colder, smoother, like a glass surface that reflected everything without distortion. I wasn't jealous when she ignored me. I wasn't hurt when she didn't text. I simply noted the silence and filed it alongside everything else. She didn't know that she was revealing herself more in silence than she ever had in conversation. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about the last time we sat in her living room. The memory wasn't painful anymore. It was analytical. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, eyes drifting toward the window even when I was talking. She kept adjusting her bracelet, turning it so the clasp faced inward. At the time I thought she was just restless. Now I understood it as a pattern. She fiddled with the bracelet when she felt guilt, not discomfort. There was a difference. Discomfort made her cross her arms. Guilt made her fidget. I found a strange comfort in knowing these distinctions. It made her feel less like someone withholding affection from me and more like someone trying to manage emotions she didn't fully understand. My fixation wasn't about wanting her back. It was about parsing the architecture of her distance, mapping the negative space she left every time she withdrew. I began noticing how she handled objects, keys, cups, books, and how the way she touched them revealed her emotional state. When she was calm, her hands were steady, deliberate. When she was tense, she held things lightly, as if afraid of leaving fingerprints. One evening I saw her drop a pen on her desk, then stare at it for a long moment before picking it up again. That pause told me more than any conversation could have. It was the pause of someone who felt watched by their own thoughts, not by another person. I wondered if she sensed my attention, not in a literal way but in the way people sometimes feel observed by the world when they're fragile. I wasn't actively watching her then. I was 2 blocks away, walking without direction, but the timing made me think about how presence and absence can overlap in ways that don't require physical proximity. The fixation deepened not because I wanted her, but because understanding her had become its own quiet reward. A puzzle that didn't need solving, only observing. And the more I observed, the more I realized she was unraveling in small, subtle ways. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous, just the slow fraying of someone living with more tension than she admitted to anyone. Maybe she thought she was better off alone. Maybe she thought pushing me away would give her space to grow. Maybe she believed the words she said about needing to live on her own. But I could see the cracks forming, not because of me, but because of the solitude she clung to like a shield that kept slipping in her hands. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindicated. I was simply attentive, and attention, when quiet enough, becomes its own kind of presence. One she never saw, but one that shaped the way I understood her more completely than she would ever understand herself. I didn't intervene. I didn't reach out. I didn't step closer. I just watched, calmly, steadily, letting the fixation settle into something almost meditative. She kept living her life, and I kept learning the rhythm of it, one small detail at a time. The morning she finally woke up alone in that particular way, the unsettled, searching way, I knew it before she did, though I wasn't anywhere near her door. I was across the street, sitting on a bench that didn't face her building directly, angled just enough that I could see the faint glow behind her curtains without looking like I was waiting for anything. It was early, earlier than her usual routine, and the light came on abruptly as if she'd been startled awake by something she couldn't explain. She kept the curtains half closed, as always, but I could see her silhouette stepping back from the window, shifting from one foot to the other, hesitating like someone checking the distance between herself and the rest of the world. I didn't move. I didn't stand, didn't approach, didn't try to catch a glimpse of her face. I just watched the shape of her morning take form, the way someone watches fog lift off a field slowly, quietly, with a kind of inevitability that doesn't need participation. The restlessness in her posture told me she felt something off, something small and interior, like waking from a dream in which someone had been standing just outside the edge of her vision. Not fear, exactly. More like awareness. She wandered through her apartment for a while, or at least I assumed so based on the shifting light. Her shadow moved from room to room in an irregular rhythm, nothing like her usual morning routine. Normally she'd go straight to the kitchen, turn on the grinder, flick the kettle switch, and lean against the counter while waiting for the water to boil. That morning she paced instead, short, uneven movements that suggested she kept walking into a thought she couldn't finish. It occurred to me that she might think she'd forgotten something, an appointment, a message, a noise she'd misheard. People often create rational explanations for sensations they don't understand. I knew she wasn't thinking about me. At least, not consciously. I hadn't seen her in days. I hadn't spoken to her since that last polite refusal. I hadn't passed directly by her window or lingered near her door or done anything that could make her feel observed. My distance had been deliberate, not as a punishment or a test, but as a final experiment in absence. Not absence for her sake, absence for mine. I wanted to know what she became when the attention she had never wanted evaporated completely, when the tension that once stretched between us went slack and left her suspended in her own solitude. Watching from across the street on that bench wasn't surveillance. It was conclusion, a kind of quiet witnessing of the person she was when no one asked anything of her, not even a question, not even a glance. After a while she finally went to make her coffee. I didn't have to hear it to know the sequence. Grinder, kettle, the soft pause as she leaned onto her counter, with both hands pressed flat. Her silhouette froze there for a moment. A long one. Long enough for me to sense that she wasn't simply resting, she was thinking. Or rather, trying not to think. I could almost imagine the look on her face, the slight furrow in her brow, the way she would purse her lips when something didn't align with her expectations. And something wasn't aligning that morning. The tension I used to see in her when I sat across from her in her living room was different from the tension I saw now. Back then, her discomfort had a direction. It pointed away from me, toward a life she wanted without my presence in it. But this tension was aimless. It wasn't pushing anything or pulling anything. It was drifting inside her like a faint echo she couldn't place. I stayed seated. I didn't want her to see me if she decided to look out the window. Not because I feared her reaction, but because realizing I was physically nearby would have given her the wrong impression that I was waiting, that I wanted something, that I believed there was still a conversation to be had. There wasn't. This was the last part of the story, and stories don't need explanations when they end quietly. Once she finished her coffee, she moved into the living room. The curtains remained half shut, but I could see enough to know she was sitting on the floor again, legs folded under her, shoulders slightly hunched. She held her mug with both hands even though she never drank coffee that hot. She stared at something, maybe the bookshelf, maybe the blank space in front of her, maybe her own thoughts forming shapes she didn't quite trust. She stayed like that for longer than usual. She looked, not afraid, but unsettled in a way that comes from realizing you've been carrying a feeling you didn't name. I wasn't responsible for that feeling. I need to make that clear, even here, even in a confession typed at 3 or 4 in the morning. I hadn't done anything to induce fear or discomfort or threat. I had simply observed, quietly and from a distance, without intruding on her life or altering it. The discomfort she felt was her own, the natural tension that grows when someone has spent too long insisting they're better off alone. She wasn't used to silence without opposition. For so long she'd defined her boundaries in relation to me, pushing back, asking for space, explaining her need for distance. But now that I had withdrawn completely, the boundaries remained, but their purpose had vanished. People don't realize how much of their emotional structure depends on the presence of someone they claim they don't want. I wasn't proud of that realization. I wasn't ashamed either. It was simply an observation, another small truth filed away with the rest. Around midday she finally opened her window. Not just a crack the way she usually did, she pushed it wide, letting the cold air in with a suddenness that made her flinch. I watched her pull her sleeves over her hands, leaning into the breeze, as though expecting something from it. Maybe a sound, maybe clarity, maybe the feeling of being alone made literal through temperature. She stayed at the window long enough that I wondered if she'd forgotten to breathe. Then her shoulders lifted slightly and she exhaled, long and uneven, as if releasing something she didn't know she was holding. That was when I knew the distance had done its work, not by punishing her or teaching her anything, but by letting the silence settle until she could hear the way it changed the echo of her own thoughts. She closed the window slowly and disappeared deeper into the apartment. I didn't need to see anything else. I stood up from the bench, not abruptly, not dramatically. Just a smooth, ordinary motion, the kind you make when you finished reading a chapter in a book and know there's no need to turn the next page yet. I walked down the street without looking back. I didn't feel triumphant or finished or resolved. I felt a steady kind of calm, the kind that comes when you've watched something unfold exactly the way it was always meant to, without intervention. I knew she would keep feeling that faint unsettledness for a while, not because of me, but because of the space left behind by something that once occupied her attention more than she admitted. She would adapt. People always do. They absorb their own silences eventually. As for me, the fixation had loosened, not dissolved, not vanished, but cooled into something inert, like embers without fuel. I didn't need to watch her anymore. I didn't need to understand her any further. I had learned everything I came to learn, even if I never meant to learn it in the first place. By the time I reached the end of the street, her window was no longer visible. The morning light had shifted, flattening everything into a soft gray. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. The story had already ended the moment she stood in her apartment feeling something missing, something unnameable, something she couldn't blame on anyone but herself. I felt nothing sharp, nothing heavy. Just quiet satisfaction, the kind that doesn't glow, doesn't surge, doesn't celebrate. A calm that feels like the end of a long-held breath. A final silence between two people who will never speak again, but who will both remember the shape of the space that once stretched between them. A silence that didn't hurt me. A silence that she would spend a long time learning how to live with. I kept walking. That was enough.